everyone. Welcome back to the Cranky Old Historian. And today I want to talk about a paramedic story. I was a EMT and paramedic, as I've mentioned several times before, and last week was EMS week, and I was reminded of a story from back in my early days. And back in 1981, I was 22 years old. I was still in the Army National Guard, Georgia Army National Guard. I had just gotten out of Big Army, and I was a 22-year-old EMT at Grady Memorial Hospital's Emergency Medical Services, which was the kind of knife and gun club, as we called it, because if you didn't have one, they'd issue you one because you needed one down in those areas. And Grady back then pretty much serviced just the kind of the grittier parts of the south side of the city. There were some other ambulance services that did Buckhead and some of the nicer, in Dunwoody, some of the nicer places in the city. But, we did kind of the grittier places. And one night, it was kind of slow, and I had my first partner, Phil, and I were just sort of wandering our district back. We didn't have stations back then. We had an area, a district we were supposed to be in. And even that was kind of new for the time. They used to run straight from Grady, right off the ramp at Grady, and then just wait there for the next call. And so we had zones, and we were in a zone, and it was, if you've ever been to Atlanta, the Fox Theater and that whole North Avenue, that whole avenue where Georgia Tech is. That was Peachtree Street split two different zones right there, 404, 405, if I remember correctly. And we were in one of those zones, and we were just sort of wandering around. So Phil pulls over in this empty parking lot a few blocks down from the Fox Theater, which somewhere close to 10th Street, Peachtree. And it was an empty parking lot. And since we pulled up, all of these scantily clad young ladies just sort of walked up to the ambulance and, "Hey boys, how are you?" And we're like, hi. It's like 2:00 in the morning, like, okay. And I'm just, Phil says, how's business? And, and they're like, "Oh, it's slow and our feet hurt. We're just sort of did this." And like it's the most natural thing in the world at 2:00 in the morning in a dark parking lot in the middle of downtown Atlanta or midtown Atlanta to be discussing this kind of thing. Well, I'm sitting there. Okay. I was raised in a quiet suburban part of Atlanta, north side of Atlanta, still inside the perimeter, but, it was quiet. Nothing ever went on. Went to what for the first 2 years was an all-white high school, went to an all-white elementary school. That was kind of the way it was back there in the 60s. And just, I'm kind of naive, to be honest. Even though I'd been in Big Army and traveled around some of the lesser nice places of the world, I wasn't catching on what's going on. And so finally we get a call, and we're like, okay, well, we'll see you around, ladies. See you around. Okay. We're leaving, and all of a sudden it just hit me like a thunderbolt. And I went, "Phil, stop!" And he jerks the ambulance to a stop and turns to me like, what's going on? I'm like, "Phil, those were prostitutes." Phil just about crapped himself laughing. He had to stop for a second. I mean, we had to sit there for a second while he laughed himself silly. And he's like, "What's your first clue, rookie?" I don't know. I've just never been around them before. Like, I've never met one before. I had, but, not streetwalker kind of prostitutes. And I'm like, I just have never been around these kind of women before. What can I say? So we're driving on, and I'm like, why were they hanging around us if they're prostitutes? I mean, we're not going to, buy their services. He said, no. He said, that's why they were hanging around us. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He said, "Did you see those kind of like real sketchy looking guys across the street?" And I went, I think, yeah, I wasn't really paying attention to them. And he said, "Yeah, that's their pimps. And they are there watching to make sure their ladies are earning money for them and making sure that they stay in on duty and they're not goofing off or whatever, and they're also protecting them from getting picked up by another pimp or basic level, very, very basic level of protection, whatever. And I'm like, okay, well, okay. He said, well, the deal is this, while we're there, no one is going to come up and get the services of one of those ladies. Cops would arrest them for being a prostitute, and so cops just sort of try to ignore them unless they're kind of forced to, usually. Fire department, they're the only ones pretty much out that time of night anyhow, and they go to station. They don't hang on the street. So and everybody else either is looking to use them, abuse them, or ignore them. So we're literally the only safe people around them. Think about that for a second. I sure did. I'm 22 years old, and I'm going, I'm the only safe person for these ladies right here? That's kind of okay. I thought about that a lot afterwards. Well, at Grady, they moved you around from zone to zone, but we stayed in that zone for a couple of months, I think. Got to know some of the ladies. And there was one I remember quite well. Blonde-haired, cute, nice figure, bubbly personality, just happy and just bubbly and just a nice person, and the kind, I'd be up there and I had my arm hanging out the window and she'd always be rubbing on the little hair on my arm and how do you do? Hey John, how are you tonight? And all this. And we just sit there and talk for a minute and, about the weather, or we'd talk about she would say she saw this bird and I really like birds and I like birds too. And so we'd talk about that and then we'd leave it. I got to where I honestly liked her, and it was just nice to talk to her. That was it. And some of the other ladies said, well, they told us that, well, she's really new here. We don't really know much about her. And matter of fact, if I recall correctly, her street name was Alice, I think. And I'm almost positive that was actually her real name, which none of them ever used their real names. But she might have. And that's what everybody kind of assumed. She was just really nice. That was about it. There was one other distinguishing thing about Alice, is that she had they all wore like short shorts. Some of them wore hose, fishnet, whatever, streetwalker costume or uniform, whatever. She had a very large Harley Davidson tattoo on one thigh, full color. And it was striking because you rarely saw tattooed anybody except for military guys. And very rare to see tattooed women, even the prostitutes back then, they didn't do a lot of tattooing. So that was very unusual. And we went on and we moved on to another zone and then another zone. And you bounce around because some of the zones are really busy and some of the zones are likely to get you shot or stabbed. And so, you kind of shifted you around so you weren't always having to be in the same place, And so several months later, we were in a zone down in the southwest part of the city. And we got a call for a person down on I-285, the perimeter highway, in between Martin Luther King Boulevard and I-20 West. And I just, okay, 10-4, we're responding. Didn't think anything much about it. It was, we respond. I just assumed it was a wreck. Well, we come pulling up and there's a couple of state troopers, all that, got the lights flashing right in the middle of the highway. And we see a body up in front of the trooper's car, lit up by the headlights. And we go up there and troopers telling us that witnesses had told them that this was someone who had been ejected from the back of a van going at high speed down the freeway. That this person had bounced along the highway several times, and the trooper told me, well, I guess they're dead because they're just lying there. So we go up, and it's a female, naked female, massive injuries. I mean, really massive injuries, all over the place. Lacerations, abrasions, road rash. She apparently had hit her head when she came out of the van on the freeway It was really, you could tell that there was massive skull fractures. She was doing something we call squirreling. That's where you have all of the bones up in the skull up in here are all fractured. There's swelling of the brain, and it's pushing all this out, so it kind of pushes out over the eyes, and at the same time it moves the eye orbitals out to the side, sort of like a squirrel looks. So, and this is, I assume, I'm not sure, I assume this is, a terminal condition. I can't see coming back from this. And she was doing this, but she was still alive. She was breathing. I had a pulse. And I'm like, damn. So we got everything, got her, did what we could on the back. Then we flipped her over to get her on the backboard, and that's when I saw a full color Harley Davidson tattoo on one thigh. It was Alice, and we got her packaged up and got her in the back of the unit, went code 3, fastest, highest priority code, back to Grady. I got her intubated, got her breathing stabilized a little bit. We got an IV line started, stopped all the major bleeding, and, that's pretty much all I could do. And we come pulling in, we get her out, we take her into the surgical emergency clinic at Grady. Grady has or back then had 7 different emergency rooms depending on the emergency. This is for SEC, surgical emergency, was for trauma, gunshots, stuff like this. Took her in there. These are phenomenal people that are in there. These are the cream of the crop of level 1 trauma center docs and nurses and techs. I mean, this is the best of the best. Took her in there. They worked her, and she had gone into cardiac arrest just as we were taking her out of the ambulance. And, I was standing on the side of the stretcher doing compressions as we rolled in, and that's a bad sign. I mean, if you've got somebody, this is called trauma arrest, and it's difficult, and it's just difficult. Took her in there, turned her over, and we sort of hung out, tried to help out as much as we could, and about an hour later they pronounced her dead. I heard later that I had to give a statement. Of course, this is going to be a court case. I heard later that somebody, a John, a customer, whatever you want to call them, had picked her up in that same lot in Midtown and had taken her somewhere. I heard that she was then gang raped by at least 7 men. And that it was a homicide case for Atlanta police, but to be perfectly honest, I don't think it was much of a priority. I never got called for court, so I doubt seriously they ever caught anybody. And to tell you the truth, the worst part of this story, the very worst part of this story, is that I heard that they never identified her. The morgue, the medical examiner's office kept her on ice for about 9 months, hoping that she would match up with a missing persons report, and never did. And I heard that she was buried in a pauper's grave in the Fulton County Potter's Field, which, if I remember correctly, was off Howell Mill Road. I'm not positive at all about that back at the time, and that she just had a numbered grave. Just, this is number so and so. And that was 45 years ago, almost exactly. I have thought about her frequently. I've thought about what had happened to her. I've wondered often if there was a mom or a dad or sister, brother, a childhood friend, schoolmate, somebody. I kind of wonder, whatever happened to Alice. And I also wondered what had driven her. She was a seriously upbeat person. And she stayed that way. That one night. She was always just cheerful and bubbly and happy. But what had driven her? What had caused her to end up selling her body for money in this dark, dirty, parking lot in the middle of Midtown Atlanta, just to survive, I guess? What had driven her to that point? And then somebody remarked, I told this story on Facebook and on Twitter for EMS Week last week, and this was my EMS Week story. Happy-go-lucky does not describe me. I'm sorry, but I carry these people like friends. And I always have, always will. And somebody suggested, well, there might have not been anybody thinking about her. She might have come out of the foster care system. And that just makes it even worse. She was unwanted, abused, and in the end dumped off on the road like an unwanted piece of meat. And that's sort of an allegory for our society. And it's not a good one either. This is what the life of EMS is like. This is what the life of a paramedic is like. Is you go into it like I did, naive, not really understanding everything. I've been a combat medic, and I'd had a couple of bad calls and a couple of things that were, but not in wartime. I was a peacetime medic, so it was just training accidents, stuff like that still stuck with me, really bad ones. A couple of suicides, things like that. Nothing like it is today. But you go into it and you want to help people, and you want to fix them. You want to help them out of their situation, their bad situation, and you want to take them to a good situation. And not just for the medical purposes, but for everything. And you learn really fast, like my wife used to say to me frequently, you cannot save them all. Well, it'd be nice to save one every once in a while. And you rarely do. It's honestly a very sad, very soul-scarring profession. And that's what the life of an EMT or paramedic, fire rescue guy, that's what they're like. And the problem is when you retire, like I'm retired now, you don't retire from that. I think about them all the time. My main former partner, Mark, asked me one time, said, did you go to therapy for all this? I said, no, I'm sort of self-medicated, which was a really, really bad idea. And he said, yeah, I went to therapy for about 10 years for a lot of the stuff we did, and it just didn't really help. That's because they were trying to treat the wrong things. And you have a hole in your soul, and what fills it is your faith and your life of faith. But it's always going to be there. As God said to Paul, says, my grace is sufficient, when Paul asked him to remove his painful thorn. And I think the reason somebody else suggested this in the comments is that Alice is still alive as long as you think about her. And she wasn't completely lost. And others talked about how, well, at least you were friendly to her, and she had a friend. I said, well, I think that's stretching it a bit to call us friends. But yes, we were friends. And I hate what happened to her. And I hate what happens to so many people. Why am I telling you this? Well, number one, I tell you this because I just want you to understand just a little bit what the life of medics is like. It's a rough life. And people get into it and say, well, I'm going to go in there and help people. What will you do? But not in the way you think. 99.5% of the time, you're doing exactly what I did with Alice. Is you're simply talking to them, and you're not alone out here. And we get a lot of calls that are like fake seizure calls, fake this, fake that. And what these people are looking for is some kind of human touch. And this is what we're missing as a society. That people are so angry about everything. People are so angry and so consumed with their rage about trivial nonsense like politics. I'm sorry, it's trivial nonsense. That the people who need us see us in rage and know that they're not going to be there for us. So, but I hope I was there for Alice, and I hope I was there for so many others, and I'm going to share some other stories later of some of my ghosts. And I hope that you may not enjoy what I'm saying or what I talk about, but I hope that you learn a little something, and go be nice to each other today. Go tell someone you love them, and I'm going to talk more about that later. Thank you for listening to me today, and I hope to see you back here again on the Cranky Old Historian.